$8,000. That's what stood between me and an operating table. My son had just closed a deal 1,500 times that size, and he still told me there wasn't a dollar in the world he could spare for his father. I want you to sit with that number for a second before I tell you anything else, because everything that happened after it only makes sense once you understand how small $8,000 really was to that family, and how enormous it was to me. My name is Josh Peters. I'm 63 years old, and until a few months ago, I was just a retired roofer living alone in a two-bedroom house in the Blenman Elm neighborhood, a few blocks off Grant Road, close enough to Reed Park that I can hear the announcer at the ball fields on a still evening if the wind's coming from the right direction. It was a Thursday evening in June, the kind of Tucson evening where the heat doesn't quit just because the sun went down. The monsoon hadn't broken yet that year, so everything outside my kitchen window looked exactly like it had for 2 straight months, bone dry, the saguaros standing there like they were daring the sky to do something about it. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd let go cold and a stack of mail I didn't feel like opening. A reminder from Tucson Electric Power, a card from my dentist, and underneath all of it, a letter from my insurance company that I already had a bad feeling about because good news doesn't usually come in an envelope that thick. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the ringtone at first, because it was a video call which my son almost never does unless he wants an audience for something. Ethan's face filled the screen before I even said hello, and behind him I could see a bar, dark wood, string lights, somebody's arm reaching past him with a bottle. Dad, you will not believe the day I had. He didn't wait for me to answer. That's not new. That's just Ethan. We closed the Cortez Ridge deal. 12 million. 12. My name is on the closing memo, Dad. That's... Ethan. That's incredible. And it was. Whatever's gone sideways between me and that boy over the years, I have never once wished him anything but good. Ashford Meyer is throwing us a whole thing tonight. I gotta go, but I wanted you to be the first person I told. Somebody yelled his name behind him. He was already turning away from the camera. Love you, Dad. Talk soon. The call ended before I could even ask what Cortez Ridge was. Funny thing about that name, I'd hear it again in about 6 weeks, and it would mean something completely different to me than it meant to him. I sat there in my kitchen a minute, phone still warm in my hand, and I felt something I wasn't proud of. Not jealousy exactly, more like standing outside a party looking through a window at your own family having a good time, without you. I coughed. 3rd or 4th time that hour. I'd had it for going on 3 weeks by then, and I'd been telling myself it was just the dry air, the dust that gets kicked up this time of year, before the rains finally break something loose in the sky. My daughter didn't buy that excuse for 1 second. Hannah showed up 2 nights later carrying a foil pan of green chile stew, the kind our neighbor Rosa Wilson had taught her to make years back. Hannah's 29, works as a hospice nurse over at a home care agency off Alvernon Way, and she has never once in her life let me get away with anything. You're still doing that cough. She set the pan down on the counter without asking if she could come in, because in her mind she never needed to ask. That's what, 3 weeks now? It's the dust, baby. Uh-huh. She crossed her arms, and I swear she looked more like her mother in that moment than she ever had before. You're seeing Dr. Alvarez on Saturday. I already called and got you in. Hannah, don't argue with me, old man. I will drive you there myself if I have to. I didn't argue. There's not a lot of point arguing with Hannah once she's made a decision. She gets that from somewhere, and I've got a strong suspicion it's me. We ate at the kitchen table, and for a while it was just easy, the way it used to be before her mother passed, before her brother moved to Phoenix and started talking to me like I was a line item he had to manage instead of a father he loved. Hannah told me about a patient she'd lost that week, an 81-year-old man named Walter who used to whistle old Tucson radio jingles from the 50s even in his last days, and how it broke her heart every single time no matter how many times it happened. How do you do that job? I asked her. Every day, watching people go. Somebody's got to sit with them. Simple. Like it wasn't the hardest thing in the world. Somebody's got to make sure nobody dies alone. I didn't know it yet, but in a few weeks that sentence was going to mean something to me I couldn't have imagined sitting at that table. Saturday came fast. Dr. Nathan Alvarez has a small practice off Broadway Boulevard, The kind of office with a fish tank in the waiting room and a receptionist who's worked there so long she remembers your name without checking the chart. He listened to my chest for a long time, longer than a man wants his doctor listening to his chest. I want to get imaging on this, he told me, already writing on a pad before he'd finished the sentence. Today, if we can. They squeezed me in for a scan that same afternoon at a facility a few blocks over. I sat in my truck in the parking lot afterward, a 2011 Silverado with 190,000 miles on it and an air conditioner that only worked if you begged it, and I told myself it was probably nothing. The call came 4 days later. Dr. Alvarez's voice had a different weight to it than it usually did. Josh, I don't want to alarm you, but I need you to come in Monday. We found a mess. I want to be straightforward with you. It's operable, and that's good news. But we need to move quickly. Weeks, not months. There it is, I thought. The other shoe. I sat in that parking lot a long time after I hung up, watching the heat shimmer off the asphalt, doing the kind of math a man does when he already knows the answer isn't going to be the one he wants. I had savings. Not much, a small account I'd kept separate for years, maybe $2,100. The kind of money you tell yourself is for emergencies right up until the emergency actually shows up and laughs at how small it is. My credit wasn't what it used to be. Roofing work does that to a man's knees and his bank account both. Monday's appointment confirmed what Saturday's scan had shown. A mass, sitting where it had no business sitting, and a surgical team who wanted me on their schedule within 3 weeks. That's when a woman named Patricia Nunez from the billing office came in, folder in hand, looking about as comfortable as a person can look while delivering news like this. Mr. Peters, I want to walk you through your coverage. Your policy has a gap for the surgical approach Dr. Alvarez is recommending. It's classified differently than standard coverage, and there's an out-of-pocket deposit required before the surgical team will reserve an operating room date. How much are we talking? $8,000. I know that's a difficult number. We do offer a payment plan for the remainder of the total bill once surgery's complete, but the deposit itself has to be paid up front. Hospital policy. $8,000. I had $2,100. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for the second time in a week, and I did the math about 6 different ways, and every single time it landed in the same place. I told myself I wasn't going to call Ethan. I told myself that for 2 whole days, mostly out of pride, partly because some part of me already knew how it was going to go. Then I called him anyway. Because that's what a father does. You swallow whatever's left of your pride, and you pick up the phone, and you hope, God you hope, that your boy is still in there somewhere underneath all that success. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear it right away. Music. Somebody laughing too loud. Glasses clinking together somewhere behind him. Dad. Hey. Can this wait? We're still celebrating the Cortez Ridge thing? Ethan, I need to talk to you about something serious. A pause. Muffled sound, like he'd stepped somewhere quieter. Put his hand over the phone. Okay. Go. So I told him. All of it. The mass. The surgery. The gap in my coverage. The $8,000 I needed within the week or they wouldn't put me on the schedule. Silence on the other end. A long one. Long enough that for one stupid second, I let myself believe he was doing the same math I'd been doing in that parking lot, and that he was about to say the words I needed to hear. Dad. His voice had gone flat. We just closed $12 million. You understand that's the fund's money, right? That's not sitting in my checking account. I've got a mortgage on the Phoenix place. I've got... He stopped himself. Started again. Colder. There's no money for you, Dad. I wish there was, but there isn't. I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count. There's no money for you, Dad. 6 words. I could recite them in my sleep. It's $8,000, son, not $800,000. You don't get it. Something sharp crept into his voice now. I spent my whole childhood watching you put every spare dollar back into Frank's company instead of into this family. I'm not doing that math again. I can't keep bailing out. I'm not asking you to bail me out. I'm asking for help with his surgery. I have to go, Dad. And he hung up. I sat at my kitchen table holding a phone that had gone quiet, looking at that same stack of mail, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the mass on the scan. I want to be fair here, because fair matters to me even now. Ethan wasn't always like this. There was a version of my son who used to ride in my truck on Saturday mornings, who used to hand me nails while I worked a roofline, who used to think I hung the moon. I don't know exactly when that boy left, and this one showed up. I only know he did. 2 nights later, Hannah showed up at my door without calling first. She does that. She took one look at my face and knew something was wrong before I got a word out. What happened? I told her everything. The diagnosis, the $8,000, the call to her brother. She didn't say anything for a second. Just stood there in my kitchen, jaw working, the same way it does when she's holding back something she wants to say about a patient's family. Then she pulled out her phone, opened her banking app, and started typing. Hannah, don't. I sold the Civic this morning. Casual, like it was nothing, like she hadn't just given up her only car. I've been taking the bus to work for 2 days. I already had savings, and between the two, I've got $6,000 for you right now. Baby, I can't take your car money. You didn't take it. I'm giving it. She looked up at me, and for a second, she looked exactly like her mother did the day she told off a contractor who tried to lowball me on a job 20 years ago. You've spent your whole life making sure I had what I needed. Let me do this one thing. $6,000. $2,000 short of what the hospital needed. I sat in my kitchen and looked at my daughter, who just sold her car to help pay for an operation her brother wouldn't touch with his funds $12 million, and something in me went very, very quiet. I didn't know it yet, but that moment in my kitchen was the last time in this story that I'd feel like the poorest man in the room. The remaining $2,000, I found the way I found most things in my life. The hard way. I liquidated what was left of that small emergency account, sold a set of roofing tools I hadn't touched in 3 years to a younger guy starting his own crew. And by that Friday, I walked into Rincon Valley Medical Center's billing office and handed Patricia Nunez a cashier's check for $8,000. We'll get you scheduled, she told me. And for the first time in 2 weeks, I let myself breathe. Surgery was set for the following Monday. Hannah took 2 days off work to sit with me before and after, which for a hospice nurse who spends her whole professional life sitting with people through the hardest parts of their lives is saying something about how she felt about this one. I won't drag you through every hour of that hospital stay. I'll tell you it was long, that the ceiling tiles in a recovery room start to look the same after enough hours staring at them, and that the first face I saw when the anesthesia wore off was my daughter's, sitting in a chair she'd pulled right up next to the bed, holding my hand like she thought I might float away if she let go. Ethan called once, the day after surgery. 4 minutes, mostly small talk. He asked if I was doing okay. He didn't ask about the money again, and neither did I. There's only so many times a man can hear no before he stops asking the question. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I wasn't angry. I was. But anger's a strange thing to carry into a hospital bed. It doesn't have anywhere to go. It just sits on your chest next to everything else that hurts. Recovery took about 2 weeks. Hannah checked on me every single day, sometimes before her shift, sometimes after, always with food, always with that same stubborn look on her face that told me arguing about it was pointless. By the second week of July, I was back to mostly myself, a little slower on the stairs, a cough that had finally quieted down, and a strange, restless energy I didn't know what to do with. I started walking the block in the mornings before the heat got unbearable, past the same saguaros I'd been looking at my whole life, past the house where Rosa Villanueva still left tamales on my porch every other week like clockwork. It was on one of those mornings, a Monday, that I found an envelope in my mailbox that didn't look like the usual bills. Heavy paper. A return address I didn't recognize at first. Cortez Ridge Holdings with a Phoenix address underneath it. Cortez Ridge. That name again. The same name my son had said into a camera at a bar 6 weeks earlier like it was the best thing that ever happened to him. I opened it, standing right there at the mailbox, and I read it twice, because I didn't believe it the first time. It was from an attorney representing Cortez Ridge Holdings, informing me that as a minority equity holder in Saguaro Roofing and Construction Supply, the company I'd worked for the better part of 24 years. The company I'd quietly bought into back in 2005 when the owner, an old-timer named Frank Delacroix, offered his longtime foreman a small stake instead of a raise he couldn't afford to give. The recent acquisition of Saguaro by Cortez Ridge Holdings had triggered a payout on my ownership position. I stood there in the Tucson heat, holding a letter that said, in language dry enough to make a lawyer proud, that I was owed just over $1.8 million. I want to explain something before you think I'm exaggerating for effect. 20 years ago, Frank couldn't afford to pay me what a foreman with my experience was worth. He offered me 8% of the company instead, a piece of paper that felt like nothing at the time. I could have cashed out plenty of times over the years. I never did. I kept reinvesting my share back into the business instead of drawing it out, because some stubborn part of me believed in that little roofing company more than I believed in my own bank account. That's why I never had much cash sitting around. It wasn't because I didn't have anything. It was because everything I had was tied up somewhere nobody could see it. I hadn't talked to Frank in almost 2 years. He'd retired to Green Valley, about 30 minutes south of the city, and we'd fallen out of the habit of calling. I drove down there that same afternoon, letter in hand, half convinced there'd been some kind of mistake. Frank was sitting on his back patio when I pulled in, looking older than I remembered, but he grinned the second he saw me climbing out of my truck. Josh Peters. I wondered when you'd show up. He waved the letter I was still holding without me even having to explain it. Cortez Ridge came in with an offer 8 months ago. Best thing that ever happened to that company. You should have seen the number they put on it. Frank. This letter says $1.8 million. That sounds about right, knowing what your stake had grown to. Casual? Like we were talking about the weather instead of a number that had just rearranged my entire life. You never took a dime out in 20 years, Josh. That's compound growth for you. I tried calling you about the deal closing, but your number had changed. It hadn't changed. I just hadn't answered a Phoenix area code in months because I figured it was a robocall. I sat with Frank a long while that evening, and he told me something that made the whole thing land even heavier. The firm that had brokered the acquisition, handled the financing, ran the deal, was a private equity advisory shop out of Phoenix called Ashford Meyer Capital. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it in Frank's backyard, because it took me a solid minute to understand what he'd just told me. Ashford Meyer Capital. The same firm my son worked for. The same $12 million deal he'd called me from a bar to celebrate. The deal he'd sworn had no money left over for me. Was the very deal that had just made me a millionaire. I drove home that night with the windows down, the desert finally cooling off the way it does once the sun's good and gone, and I didn't say a word to anybody for 2 days. I needed to think. Here's the thing I want you to understand about me, because it matters for what comes next. I didn't sit on that money to punish anybody. I sat on it because I needed time to think clearly about what I wanted it to mean, and clear thinking has never happened fast for me. I called Hannah first, not to tell her about the money, but just to see her. She came over that Wednesday with a bag of groceries she absolutely did not need to buy on a hospice nurse's salary, and while she was putting things away in my kitchen, I finally told her. She set down a carton of eggs very slowly, like her hands needed a second to catch up with what her ears had just heard. $1.8 million. A little over, from what the attorney's saying. There's still some legal work to finalize it into a trust. Dad, her voice cracked on the word, a month ago you were down to your last $2,100 and I was selling my car to help cover a hospital deposit. That's right. I reached across the table and took her hand. The same hand that had held mine in that recovery room. You sold your car for me, Hannah. You took the bus to work for 2 weeks so I could get on an operating table. I have thought about this every day for the last 2 days, and I want you to hear me say it plain. This money is going to you. All of it. Dad, no. That's not. It's already decided. I met with an attorney yesterday. The trust is being drawn up right now, and it's irrevocable once it's signed. Every dollar. She cried right there in my kitchen, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than the number itself. And I held on to her and thought about her mother and how proud Susan would have been of the woman our daughter turned into. I didn't know it yet, but word travels fast in a family, even through people who aren't supposed to be talking to each other anymore. The trust finalized on a Monday in late July. I paid off Hannah's payday loan balance in full. She'd taken one out at a punishing interest rate to help cover some of my hospital costs on top of the $6,000 she'd already given me. Something she hadn't even told me about until the attorney's paperwork surfaced it. I cleared the remaining balance on her apartment lease. I set aside a chunk to help her start the tutoring program for underprivileged kids she'd been talking about for 2 years but never had the capital to launch. And I bought her a car. Nothing flashy, just something reliable that wouldn't leave her stranded at a bus stop at 6 in the morning ever again. None of that was public information. None of it should have been anybody's business but ours. But Ashford Meyer Capital handles the cap table for every deal it closes. And somewhere in the back office of that Phoenix firm, on a Wednesday morning, about 10 days after the trust finalized, somebody ran a routine post-close ownership report on the Saguaro Roofing acquisition, and my name came up as the single largest individual payout on the entire deal. I imagine it took about 30 seconds for that report to land on the desk of a junior associate. I imagine it took about another 30 seconds for that associate to say my last name out loud in an open office where my son happened to be sitting. Ethan showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening. 3 days after that report must have crossed somebody's desk in that Phoenix office. He didn't call first. He didn't knock the way a guest knocks. He pounded on the door hard enough that I heard it from the kitchen. I opened it, and my son was standing on my porch in a suit that probably cost more than my truck, face red, jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of myself in my worst moments. "You want to explain to me," he started before I'd even gotten the door fully open, "why my father's name is on a cap table for a deal I closed." "Come in, Ethan." "No, I want an answer right now." $1.8 million, Dad. You've had 8% of Saguaro Roofing this whole time and you never once mentioned it. Not when I was in college taking out loans. Not when you called me crying for $8,000 for surgery. I wasn't crying, and watch how you talk to me in my own house. He pushed past me into the kitchen anyway, and I let him, because some part of me knew this conversation was coming, and there wasn't any avoiding it. You let me sit there and refuse you. You let me think I was the bad guy for not bailing out a father who apparently had almost $2 million sitting in equity this entire time. I didn't have it, Ethan. Not when you and I talked on the phone. The deal hadn't closed yet. I found out about the payout 2 weeks after my surgery, from a letter in my mailbox, same as anybody else would have. Convenient timing. It's not convenient, it's the truth. Sit down. He didn't sit. He stood there in the middle of my kitchen, the same kitchen where Hannah had slid an envelope of cash across the table for me a month earlier, and I watched something ugly move across his face. "So where's my share?" There it was. Not "Are you okay, Dad?" Not "I'm sorry about what I told you on the phone." Where's my share? There isn't one. Excuse me. The trust is already finalized, Ethan. Irrevocable. Every dollar of that payout went to your sister. His face went a color I'd never seen on him before. You gave all of it to Hannah? She sold her car for me. She emptied her savings. She took out a payday loan at an interest rate that should be illegal, so I could get on an operating table. And she never once asked me for anything in return. You told me there was no money for me, and then you asked me for a share of money you didn't even know existed a week ago. Do you hear yourself? That money should have been split between us. I'm your son. You are my son. You'll always be my son. But being my son isn't the same as earning anything, Ethan. And I think somewhere in that firm you work for, around all those closing dinners and champagne toasts, you forgot the difference. He slammed his hand flat on my kitchen table, the same gesture I'd have expected from a man twice as desperate as him. You're going to regret this. This family is going to fall apart over your pride. This family already fell apart, son. It fell apart the night you told me there was no money for me and went back to your party. I just didn't say it out loud until right now. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the first real monsoon thunder of the season rolling in off the mountains. The kind of storm the whole city had been waiting on for 2 straight months, finally arriving right when nobody expected it. I needed help. Quieter now, because there wasn't any anger left in me for shouting. I called you first, Ethan, before I called your sister, before I called anybody. I called you because you're my son, and some part of me still believed you'd show up. You didn't. Hannah did. That's not me being petty. That's just what happened. He stood there another few seconds, jaw working, staring at me like he was trying to find an argument that would land. He didn't find one. "Get out of my house, Ethan." He left without another word, and I heard his car peel out of the driveway hard enough to leave a mark on the asphalt. I sat down at my kitchen table alone, listening to that storm finally break over Tucson, rain hitting the roof I hadn't climbed in years. And I thought about Frank Delacroix offering a stubborn young foreman 8% of a company instead of a raise he couldn't afford, and how neither one of us had any idea what that piece of paper would turn into 20 years down the line. Hannah called me the next morning. She'd already heard from a mutual friend that Ethan had shown up furious, and she wanted to check on me the way she checks on everyone. Gently, like she was afraid I might break. "He's not going to forgive you for this," she told me. "I know. Are you okay with that?" I thought about it a long moment, watching the last of the storm clouds drift east over the Rincon Mountains. Everything outside my window finally green after 2 months of dust. "I called him first, baby. When I needed help, I called your brother first. He told me no. You showed up with $6,000 and a car you sold without blinking. I don't need Ethan to forgive me for giving that money to the person who actually earned it. I need him to understand it. Those aren't the same thing, and I've made my peace with which one I'm going to get." She was quiet for a second. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, baby. Now get some rest. You've got patients tomorrow who need you a lot more than I do right now." I hung up the phone and sat on my porch for a while, watching the water run down the street the way it does after a real Tucson storm, cutting little rivers through the dust that had been sitting there for months waiting for exactly this. Somewhere across town, my son was probably explaining to somebody at that firm why the biggest payout on his own deal had gone to a family he'd walked away from. Somewhere closer, my daughter was probably already asleep, worn out from a day spent sitting with somebody else's family, through somebody else's hardest hour, the way she always does, the way she always has. 20 years ago, I took 8% of a roofing company instead of a raise I needed a lot more at the time. It turned out to be the best deal I ever made. And not because of the money, because it taught me, all these years later, exactly who was going to show up when I had nothing left to offer anybody, and who was only ever going to show up for the numbers. I know which one of my kids I'd hand my last $2,100 to, again, if I had to do it all over. And I know which one I wouldn't. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.